afternoon. Welcome to New Talk. It's the opposite of Old Talk, right here on Synergy TV. Watch what happens live, and we're here live at Synergy Studios to talk about something that unfortunately we don't spend enough time dealing with in this country. We're talking about abuse and gender-based violence. In Trinidad and Tobago, just very recently, we had an incident that sparked national outrage of a young man beating his significant other violently in a public place, in a bar, no less, presumably because that young lady was being unfaithful. Now, nobody knows the true story. As it stands now, the person had turned himself in, but the idea that something like that could happen so easily in our space and our social consciousness still doesn't have the tools or even know how to respond to something like this is the reason why I want to have this show today. Can we get to the bottom of it? Like, what is abuse in Trinidad and Tobago? How do we respond? How do we identify? What are the next steps? So I brought two gentlemen here with me to have just that conversation. We already know, if you're watching this, if you've been watching this show for a while, you already know the gentleman to my left, Joseph Quesnel, psychology student at the University of the West Indies. And to my right is someone that I actually just had the pleasure of meeting. His name is Cheyenne Baptiste, and he works at PSI Caribbean as their communications officer. Also has a psychology background, and as it stands right now, PSI Caribbean is doing a gender-based violence campaign called Make It Stop. Right? And could you tell us a little bit about that campaign really quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. So PSI is a global health organization, and we deal with sexual reproductive health, non-communicable disease, and gender-based violence. We initially started this campaign it's been in the making for a few years now, and we've partnered with Indrani from Indrani's Life Foundation. Now, gender-based violence is a serious issue. It's been a part of our society for so long, and it does affect sexual reproductive health, because if you look at the statistics, people who are in a relationship that is violent have higher incidences of STIs. And it affects when I say non-communicable disease, I'm talking about health issues that are pervasive in our country as well, diabetes and health stress-related issues. And of course, gender-based violence could be an NCD issue as well.
Right, so, cool. We just concluded the 16 days of activism on...
yeah, it actually is still going on. It is finished on the 10th.
On the 10th, right.
Our activities have been...
Okay, cool.
complete.
So I want to go ahead and ask the first question. Do Trinidadians understand what abuse is in this country? We have all these conversations, like every so often, we have something that happens in the national consciousness that spurs a reaction. But then there are those who say, for example, in the same incident we were speaking about the gentleman beating his girlfriend, there are folks who had the gall to say that she looked for that. Yeah, so that it means to me that we don't necessarily understand what abuse is objectively, do we?
I think that we have a very basic understanding of abuse. I don't think that the understanding we have right now is necessarily wrong. I just don't think it's very deep. I think it's a very shallow understanding that's really, really limited to those visual aspects, those very vivid aspects that we can easily imagine, at the very least. Or that unless we know somebody directly involved, we won't really have the appreciation for what the dynamic of abuse really involves. And by that I'm saying that we kind of understand it. Some of us have friends that we know that kind of have helped out to understand the situation, or can point it out very easily, when abuse is going on. Usually when it's physical violence, people have no problem saying, oh, that's the person is being abused, it's clear, it's obvious, And in all fairness, this is one of the more visible, noticeable forms. And I don't think we're wrong about those, usually. I can't say that we are, because most of the times when they pop up in our public sphere, they are actually abusive.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to really get examples to the contrary. But I think, to sum it up, we just have a very basic understanding, not too much more than that. And I think it would take either experience or knowing somebody and having seen the emotions, seeing the breakdown or feeling the damage yourself indirectly or directly, hopefully not directly, to really understand how abuse affects a person. But whether with respect to knowledge, no. Yeah. There's this intuitive, understanding, but very little discussion in the public forum generally, I find.
Okay, anything you want to add, Cheyenne?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we become more aware in our society of abuse when we see the actual physical abuse. But what we don't see, or what maybe we don't fully comprehend, are the issues behind what led to that guy beating his girlfriend. What led to that physical activity? And so things like financial abuse, things like verbal abuse, emotional abuse, those are the underlying sort of factors that's like in that boiling pot. And what we see is that pot just bubbling over. And we say, oh yeah, that's abuse. But we don't realize that when you have somebody who's absolutely controlling and want to control every aspect of your life, that is one of the signs. It can be one of the signs.
So you highlighted more than one form of abuse there. Is that as far as the spectrum goes? We have physical abuse, we have emotional abuse, we have verbal abuse. You mentioned financial abuse. Is there any other form that we're missing?
Well, there's sexual abuse.
Right,
sexual
abuse,
obviously,
sexual
but
is that it? Well, then let's describe stuff like let's describe this.
Clearly, there's more, but we've outlined the categories, and within those categories,
there's quite a bit more. Yeah.
There's a lot of it.
Okay, cool. So let's try to get as objective as we can. We understand very easily what physical and verbal abuse look like and feel like. Financial abuse for a lot of our viewers is probably unknown, right? What's the connection between physical abuse and financial abuse? What are the things that make those two things alike?
If there's one thing I can say before I let Cheyenne fill in, is I think it's power. This needs to be in control of all of the matters, whether it be within the household or within the context of the relationship. And so a person who is using money to control the other person, in other words, by denying them funds, and a person who is using violence in order to control the other person physically by just sheer terror, or by inducing guilt or other different things that come along with these manipulations.
Right.
That, that central idea of needing to be in complete control of either this other person or this context. And I think that's a part that can connect both the aspect of physical violence and the aspect of financial abuse, where the person is being manipulated in that context. Though the process is a little different. There are patterns of physical violence, but I think we'll get into that in a little bit.
Okay, cool. Anything that you want to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think that to really be simplistic in this is you're dealing with an element of control, and how do people exercise control is through drastic action, drastic behavior, whether it's through violence, whether it's through verbal control, like verbal abuse. So once you see that pattern, I mean, it's stirring up that pot, and eventually that pot is going to overflow.
Okay, but
it's exercising control to a point where you need to have that form of control in order to have a working relationship.
Okay, but do you think that abusers, do they know that it's about control? Do they know what?
That's a good question.
And I mean, I'm obviously not apologizing for them, for those watching at home, but the idea that every single abuser rather is systematically employing these tools because they know that X equals Y, I feel like that might be too easy to say, would it?
I don't think so. I don't think they're doing that at all. I think that I think people are naive, personally speaking, that they do these things because they're not aware of the systems that they're engaging in actively. I think that if they were aware, that would be a very particularly twisted person. But just like the rate of serial murders to murders of passion, it's a very, very small percentage, even among the worst of crimes, where people are very deliberate about the actions that they do, And so I can't quite, I wouldn't be able to say with any real feeling of honesty that the people who are doing the abuse do it because That's their explicit goal. That's their one thing that they've set themselves out to do is to have that control. I think they're doing it because they're feeling feelings inside that are compelling them to act, and they're not responding to it in healthy ways.
Okay. Exactly.
Okay, so we're saying now that abusers are kind of responding unconsciously. That doesn't change the fact that what they're doing is wrong, but does it change how we deal with them?
It certainly changes the way we should approach conflict management. We see that every day. We see that when people are in traffic. We see it in road rage. We see it in schools. We see it in the homes. And it's really about understanding what are the triggers. And most people who are in abusive relationships, maybe they're not aware that, okay, well, this is abuse, because all they know is how to deal with a particular scenario, whether it be through violence or whether it be through, just lashing out verbally.
Actually, I could provide a very potentially culturally appropriate example of an idea that people have generally that is not healthy, actually. This idea of venting. Now, some of us, venting is a mix. Now, this is a mix. This is an issue that, this is why I'm saying, because it's something that we all kind of understand.
It's a loose term, though.
It's a loose term.
Yeah.
The term where it's healthy is where you're trying to communicate your frustrations to your friend, just so you can feel less burdened by it, okay? Right. The term where it's not healthy is where you engage in any behaviors, any violent behaviors, for the purpose of relieving said frustrations.
Right. So cuss out your girlfriend or your boyfriend,
that is
and then you say you're just venting. That
is not venting in a healthy way, in any way. And that idea that venting is healthy across the board is totally false. No.
That's just taking out your frustrations.
That's taking your frustrations out on somebody else. But there's actually some science to this. When you engage in any behavior, just the response set gets stronger. This is a basic understanding of learning theory.
Right. Gets easier
to do. It just exactly that. It gets a little bit easier to do. And now, when you take a violent set of behaviors or violence response set, this is the important part. It's a response set to an emotion that you're doing. Okay? Somebody who's in gym who's punching a punching bag isn't going to go home and punch their girlfriend or nothing. Someone who's in a gym or a boyfriend, I don't know, who's in the gym and they're punching a punching bag because they are angry, that person might go home and punch their girlfriend or boyfriend. It's the response to the emotion that we give. And so if we're using violence as a means to vent, then that may cross contexts. It may not, but it may.
You're saying that we have poor emotion management and that's a reason for abuse?
I think some of it is related to, I think we do in this context, but I think some of that is related to the ideas we have about what's acceptable responses to certain emotions. And these ideas, these philosophies of mind, not to be too rude to the fellow who started it all, but Freud came up with this idea of venting, that people should vent. Yeah. And the thing is, some people vented successfully and some people vented and failed miserably. They became more violent, more aggressive because they weren't actually venting in the right way. They weren't actually communicating their problems to somebody to be understood or to feel release. They weren't communicating. They were just engaging in violence to sort of get out of that circumstance. And that's a really bad method of communicating, if you want to call it anything, and that's if you put that into a normal human setting, that's abusive. It's abusive. You can't beat somebody because you feel angry. That's not how communication works at all. That shuts down communication. And
it's interesting you said that, because you hear in regular conversation, oh man,
very common.
I'm angry, just get somebody a punching bag and release the frustrations.
Right, could I say something that's even scarier? And a friend of mine, I like to tell stories on YouTube. I have a friend of mine who was in a relationship with a young lady who thought that the only way that they would have a healthy relationship is if he argued with her more. Yeah?
If you are what?
If he argued with her more.
If he argued with her more.
Yeah. Is this the same kind of trend that we're talking about, this kind of unhealthy response set to emotion that people now kind of normalize? That if this person isn't arguing with me, they're bottling stuff in or they're being dishonest?
It's similar to the conversation we were speaking about with, equating love.
This was before the show began.
Before the show, equating love with fighting physically or verbally And that there's no equation. It's not, you know.
Yeah, no.
There's a difference between fighting for somebody and in terms of being healthy and communicating and doing your best so that you can actually fight for the relationship, not fight with the person in the relationship. So
exactly. And now that you brought that up, that actually, that's such